Welcome to a very special episode of Around Aretuza. Today, having a roundtable about the State of Gwent with some very, very fine members of not only the Gwent community, but the Team Aretuza community. First up, a resident Scotsman, Driftbling. How are you?
Not the worst effort I've ever heard.
There
Certainly
you
better than
go.
Rims anyway.
Okay.
Hey,
Oh, fuck
everybody.
off.
Yeah.
Hey, welcome everybody. Hi, I'm Driftbling. For those who don't know me, former competitive manager of Bandit Gang, now general layabout of Team Aratuza. I have opinions about many things, and you might even hear some of them. Yeah, I'm excited to have a chat. Obviously, it's a great group of guys. We could have I like to think, somewhat important discussion with, and hopefully start some good talk in the community about the state of Gwent right now and where things are going. So yeah,
Awesome. Next up, Redrame.
Hi, I'm Redrame. Uh, I always struggle with these introductions, but I guess I'm supposedly a team manager and a competitive manager of Team Aratuza. I'm a streamer. I played Gwent at some point. Uh, I'd like to think I still play Gwent. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to think people on the roundtable will still play it somewhat. All right, and last but absolutely not least, Santtu, how are you today?
Well, I'm Santtu. I'm the competitive manager for Gwent in other tools, and I'm very active tournament player, even if not so active on ladder anymore.
All right, so we're gonna jump right into it, and I hope my buttons work. First topic on here: how's the balance of the current game? Is it competitive? Is it fun? And Driftbling, why don't you start us off there?
yeah. I mean, one of the things I feel like there's a bit of a cycle with Gwent at the moment in the last little while, where what seems to happen is everyone waits for an expansion. So the last one was Master Mirror, and just before that, the meta will be somewhat balanced if stale. And then we get an expansion, massively overtuned cards. Some cards come along from the ride from previous meta, some cards fall out because they're just power crept. We then end up in a situation where things need to get balanced constantly, cut, and people are sitting there thinking, the game's a bit shit right now, it's not really fun. And they're waiting for the next expansion to make everything better. Then the next expansion comes, and it goes over and over again. So I'm wondering, from other people's point of view, how they feel about the current expansion, how it's worked out, and where we are now. Because from my point of view, I feel especially when you do streams with weaker cards or worse archetypes, where a lot of the the cards in the game or the previous archetypes, even the previous expansions, go back a couple expansions, they just don't live up to what they used to do anymore, and it feels very, very difficult to get anywhere without the right cards right now. And I think it's only going to get worse. So yeah, especially from the fun aspect, I feel the game's lacking at the moment. But that's my opinion. So I'm interested to see what the other guys think of it.
Okay, so yeah, I do think that is something definitely talk about. Just is it fun? So what do y'all say, Red Rame Santtu? Is the game right now? Would you consider it, I guess, fun in that expense, especially in relation to what he mentioned about the expansions?
I think
From the perspective of trying to play the fun cards over the competitive cards, it's kind of hard for me to say because I mostly just play with the cards that are good right now. But from the competitive perspective, I'm not sure if it's any less or more fun than it has normally been. Right now there is like 5 factions that are properly viable and then Nilfgaard that can do something. So it's kind of nice to have at least options when building lineups. But I don't know if it's more fun than it has been before. I don't think it's much less fun than it has been before.
I think I have kind of a weird perspective on this because I know that I have been in like both Driftbling's and Santtu's shoes when it comes to trying to play competitively, but also at the same time, sort of just trying to play for entertainment value or to have fun or to try something out that other people normally wouldn't. Um, and I think the biggest thing about the latest expansion uh, that I have noticed is that a lot of factions got broken tools that sort of are able to compete with each other because they're just very high value cards that can sort of define a deck. But that also sort of just monopolize their respective factions to the point where if you try to build a deck that doesn't revolve around those cards, you feel the punishment for it a lot more than in the past. Say you just didn't play like one specific good card that was like commonly seen. That was maybe just like a more standard vanilla value card than something like an Echo Tutor, like Amphibious Assault, that you can play twice. That is like a massive provision investment, but also just gives you an insane return on those provisions. So I feel like from that perspective, I think the game is theoretically balanced, but I think that there might be a bit of an overemphasis and also a bit of a misinterpretation of what that means. I think that a game being competitively balanced does not always necessarily mean that the card pool is healthy. And I feel like, as Driftbling said, a lot of the power creep was sort of overdone, and also sort of done to cards that aren't necessarily like cards that you would consider to be archetype defining, but just sort of are forced to you're sort of just forced to jam them in there anyway. And those sorts of cards feel bad to me.
So what kind of cards are you specifically referencing? The Echo cards, is that it, or anything else?
I would say, personally, I would include Novigradian Justice and Scoia'tael as a pretty good example, where it's a card that plays for a really good tempo dump plus 2 thin, which is just really, really powerful. It gives a deck consistency. It also gives it round 1 tempo or round 2 bleed potential. It's just a really, really great card. And it's notable that I don't think, certainly, unless I'm massively missing something, which is possible, but I don't think between Precision Strike and Symbiosis you've really had a competitively relevant deck that doesn't run it recently. I mean, does the or Symbiosis? I don't know. I haven't paid as much attention to the competitive as I should have recently. But yeah, it's cards like that that tends to just, if you cut them, you instantly notice by a huge margin. You're sitting going, "Where's my justice? Where's one of my incredibly strong tools that I should have every game that does well every game?" You know, I very much agree with a lot of the points Rame's making here.
With Justice and Amphibious Assault, there's at least the fact that you can really put them into whatever deck you want. But when it comes to like Expansion Herald, that you have to run Devotion for, but you have to also play it because it's so strong. That means that you can't play any neutral cards in Skellig, for example. I think that's an even bigger problem.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking more in line with what Santtu was saying. I don't necessarily disagree with Driftbling. I think that when there are cards that sort of are vanillas that play a bit over the curve, potentially you could look at those as maybe being unfun. But I think in the case of Justice, it was more the volunteer buff that sort of pushed it over the edge. And I feel like that, from a balance perspective, is sort of a more reasonable problem to have in your game, because it was a change that was made more recently as an attempt to push a different card, which was volunteer, not Justice. And it just ended up having a side effect. Whereas something like Herald or Skjordal or Blood Eagle are just very strong cards that creep out an entire faction, are very clearly much more intentionally printed, and I think also much harder to avoid because you can't splash them. Yeah, I feel like that would be my take on that.
Okay, and so right now, today, if you're listening to this in the future or on the video or the VOD or whatever, there were no balance changes and no patch changes for today. Is that good or bad, do you think? And Drift, go ahead and start us out. What are your opinions on that?
I mean, I would personally like to see more than nerfs. I think as a community, sometimes we all kind of pivot to nerfs maybe a little bit too much. I would like to see some kind of buffing support for some of the extremely dead archetypes. But it's very easy to say that, right? And maybe not as easy to do it without. Ray makes a good point about how Justice was made powerful by a buff to a completely different card that, in theory, wasn't pointed at Justice, but it kind of ended up that way. And so, in theory, if you buffed, say, Movement Scoia'tael, right, which has been pretty much a dead archetype forever, you could buff that, but really end up just buffing one of the cards that ends up in a different deck that could end up overtuned because you're trying to make that good. But with that kind of potential problem aside, I would have liked to see some attempts, especially in a kind of, non-competitive season as far as the ladder and qualifying for official tournaments is concerned. I would have liked to see some attempts to make some of the really, really weak archetypes more competitive and make the meta more varied in terms of the choices you can make within the faction, not only which faction you want to play and which faction's good cards you want to play.
So one thing I think that's important to notice that they are saying that there should be a balance patch during this month in the middle, right? And I think that also matters a lot because, like, if there was no balance patch in the middle of this month, I would definitely not be happy with not getting anything for 2 months. But if there's going to be a balance patch in the middle of this month, I don't mind waiting a little longer for that. And I think that the timing for the balance patch to be in the middle of this month is a little better for masters than the balance patch becoming right now. Because you get you get enough time for the meta to get somewhat settled, but not to be completely solved before masters.
Okay, so to hit on with that, we will go seamlessly into the next one. And we'll lead this off with Redrame. So dealing with that, how do you feel about the current methodology?
Yeah, I typed out methodology, but it's fine. I just wasn't really sure what word to use.
No, it's methodology.
It's kind of a placeholder for another word because methodology is a weird word.
Yeah,
how do I feel about the current how CDPR does their balance changes? How about that?
Yeah, and then how would you change it? So as we stumble into this topic, go ahead and take it away.
Yeah, sorry about that.
That's my fault. I'm a pro.
But yeah, I think the biggest thing for me with the balance changes is that I've noticed a lot of changes that I think CDPR sort of tries to sit the fence a little bit in terms of they do make changes to cards that don't see play, sort of in spirit to try to buff those cards or quote unquote keep them relevant. But it feels like a lot of those changes sort of lack intent to me. I think the biggest thing to me about CDPR's balance changes system is that it really feels like they overuse the provision system as a tool, just because when Homecoming came and they introduced the provision system among several other tools, it just became another number that they could adjust. And I think from a theoretical perspective, that's really enticing, especially if you don't have as much ability to adjust the power of cards as a result of the numbers getting smaller. But I think that there is a big difference between a card that is not seeing play because it is too weak and a card not seeing play because it is not interesting and would have to be made overpowered in order for it to see play. Something like a vanilla or something like just a very uninteresting card or an engine that is like really greedy but really easy to remove, and at some point something might come along that like pushes it into viability. Like those sorts of cards, a very small change to them can turn them from underpowered to overpowered. And I think that a lot of cards that have more fundamental problems and would be in need of an effect change or at the very least a power level change sort of just get neglected the treatment that they need as a result of how easy it is for CDPR to just say, oh, this card isn't seeing play at 8 provisions, let's make it 7. Or this card is a little too good at 12 provisions, let's make it 13. So I feel like as a result of that, like a lot of times the provision system itself is what catches flack for this. But I think an important thing to remember is that the original game of Gwent in beta also sort of had a provision system. Like if you think of bronze cards as being worth 4 provisions, silver cards as being worth 8, and gold cards being worth 12, and every leader having the same amount of provisions to whatever that deck totals up to, there's your provision system. But the tiers were sort of dramatic enough that it wasn't really a reasonable decision to say, oh, this card is too OP as a bronze card, let's make it a silver card. And I feel like as a result of that, CDPR was forced to be a little bit more clever with their changes. And I'm not saying that you should never tweak the provisions of a card. It is a useful tool for cards that I think are well liked but a little overbearing or a little bit or just not quite there. But I do think that it's something that's sort of just been over relied upon.
One thing with provisions I think is probably worth mentioning is it can be relevant how a card fits into a current established deck, especially if that deck has a couple of slots which are somewhat filler or flex. Where if you suddenly say this card at 9 provisions is really hard to fit into deck X, but at 8 provisions you can suddenly get it in, that does end up having as much of an impact on competitive play sometimes as how good the card was or wasn't at 9. Like certain restrictions based on that can be as important. So sometimes there is, I would argue, a relevant factor to say, well, let's say instead of, if you want to give it a small buff, instead of cutting 9 to 8, you make it still 9, but buff its power by 1 if it's a unit, say. Those two changes can actually be quite different based upon the place that the current meta decks are in terms of trying to fit in a card like this. It's kind of weird to talk about this theoretically without talking about examples, but I'm trying my best.
Yeah.
This is one thing. It becomes difficult without concrete examples, but yeah, I hope what I'm trying to say makes some sort of sense.
It makes sense, but is this something that GDPR can actually use to think about it? More often, you can actually see how that effect will go when you make the change, because the deck will most likely be different after the patch.
I think it is something that's a little bit difficult to have the foresight on, but at the same time, there are ways to do it. I think one thing that Driftbling is sort of expressing the importance of context in a deck. Like, for example, if a deck, a one provision change in a deck that's having a very difficult time fitting cards is a much more significant buff than a one provision change in Nilfgaard. I'll just fucking say it.
Nilfgaard, the black sheep of Gwent right now.
The black sun never shines in this meta, unfortunately.
Just nobody knows what to do with Nilfgaard.
There is nothing to do with Nilfgaard. They don't have any cards, but that's a whole other topic. We could go into why Nilfgaard is so trash. We could definitely talk about it, but
some would actually just be happy that Nilfgaard isn't viable, because I guess you can say when it comes to that, whenever they are viable, they're no fun, and that's the only way to make them viable.
I feel like that's kind of a myth.
Okay.
Honestly, there are a few specific cards that have been viable for a long, long time in Nilfgaard that I think sort of contribute to that no fun image. The biggest one by far being Masquerade Ball. That card is just problematic. And it was the thing keeping Nilfgaard afloat until Nilfgaard wasn't afloat. I feel like there were other attempts to push Nilfgaard into other directions, and then CDPR killed them all. I personally was a big fan of the Elder Bear deck. I thought that it actually made sense. There was actually a good level of synergy in that deck. There were interesting decisions to be made. It could play the round plans sort of flexibly, and you kind of it was sort of interesting to try to get the most out of your tools based on the matchup that you were in. It felt like it played well, and it wasn't overly focused on control, but still had a little bit of that Nilfgaard identity.
I think that's a good deck, but at the same time, I must admit that if there has to be one faction that is not viable, I'm not mad at this Nilfgaard.
instead of a fourth faction, it's now the sixth faction. Excellent. Now, the funny thing about, I think the Elderbeard's deck is a really interesting one because it kind of touches on there's a interesting thing with balance where there's a difference in some ways between balancing to the top kind of competitive aspect and balancing, let's say average ladder player, for lack of a better way of putting it, but let's say, low pro rank, whatever. Because it's funny, most of the competitive players I talked to didn't mind the Elderbeard deck or liked it. But most of the, kind of more casual players hated the deck because they hated they can just use a leader charge in round 1 to trap you, it's cheating. They hated the Elder Bears. They hated not having answers to them in a large variety, especially of less competitively viable decks where they couldn't get through a defender, say, for instance. And things like that, people get really, or even just the classic Nilfgaard's nonsense mirror matchup where it became who can bribery more Elder Bears, smiley face. And it's a deck that definitely had a lot of hate towards it. So I understand why CDPR ended up nerfing that deck, because it was hated by a section of the community hugely. But it raises an interesting issue, which is it's very difficult to balance both for more casual, fun players to find the game enjoyable, while also having things be competitively interesting. As you say, the decision-making aspect at a high level is a huge thing, and that deck had it in spades, where some other decks don't to the same degree. So losing a deck like that from the competitive scene does seem sad, but on the other side of the coin, I know a lot of people who were fist bumping when that deck left the meta. So there's different perspectives, right? So it's hard for CDPR to take all of them into account.
Okay, let's hit on that competitive edge in that sense. The next one in there. How do you feel about the way official State of Gwent tournaments are operated, fair format, time commitment, etc.? Santtu, go ahead with it.
So now with the Masters Season 2 ending, I mean ending soon, there's still the Masters itself, but how do you it's important to discuss the changes what are made from Season 1 and how do we feel about them? For example, with more qualifiers and qualifiers with the main change, but with also with what the online format did to the Opens. And at least, how do you hear about the qualifiers? With more every shot coming from qualifiers and every season mattering for qualifiers. So any opinions? I can be giving my own as well. So I like the Season 2 system a lot more than I like Season 1 system. I think it gives more opportunities for people who don't play as much, even if they just play well, and while also rewarding the players who play a lot with ladder spot to masters. Whether or not I like the way the master spot go is maybe a different question, but it does give something to everyone, and I think it's still rewarded consistency pretty well with Wangit making it to every open and Tailbot and Demarcation making it free, I think.
So, well, I'm the only person who's not really myself competed. I've worked with teams. The biggest thing I suppose I would say in terms of the current system, the way that top 64 matters, and there's a lot of players I know who the best point I think you can make is the time commitment on the ladder itself, where they just, even if they had a great win rate, they just simply don't have the time to really compete for those top few spots on ladder. So the fact that they can make to top 64 with playing about half a season worth of games, and then being able to go to a tournament to try to compete for that open spot, I think does give more for more people, which it's a phrase in my head I'm trying to get away from because it sounds really dumb, but there's more opportunity for a wider range of players to be competitive, to go to tournaments to try and win them. At the end of the day, I've heard complaints along the lines of, well, the best ladder players should be rewarded more, but the thing is that it's a bit glib, but if you can't do well ever at the open qualifiers, why do you think you'd do well at the opens? If you see what I mean. If there's a player who consistently always does well in ladder, but never does well at tournaments, it's not really a part. I suppose you could argue the financial point of view of getting to an open would be a fair aspect, but in terms of actually winning something, if you can't win a qualifier, you're probably not able to win an open either. I would say generally seems unlikely your tournament prep is going well if you consistently fall short at qualifiers, but maybe that's harsh. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not really sure where the sort of current line of discussion is publicly on this matter, because I feel like there are sort of two ways to look at this. I think there's the way of saying relative to Season 1, I think the changes were just good, frankly speaking. Like, I think that Season 1 had an overemphasis on ladder. You were seeing some players abuse the ladder. You were seeing other players who were very good at ladder but weren't really performing as well as expected in tournaments. And it seemed like the public was sort of getting tired of seeing those faces when there wasn't sort of the ability to play in tournaments to back it up at times. And I feel like there's definitely some merit to being good at ladder and wanting to be rewarded for that, but at the same time, I feel like if you're going to be it feels like ladder play and tournament play differ fundamentally enough that if you're not checking competitive players for their tournament playability on the way to open, that your system is flawed. I would argue that if anything, season 2 didn't go far enough. I would really like to see more tournament play be rewarded, particularly for Gwent World Masters. The fact that 4 people are getting in entirely through ladder. Obviously, I'm happy that one of them is Colamon, but personal biases aside, I think that it would be much better if there was something a little bit more analogous to the Open qualifier. I'm not necessarily suggesting a World Master qualifier because that's kind of a very high stakes tournament. I'm not sure how I would do it. I think some of the logistical challenges might be part of the reason it's not being done. But I really would like to see more because tournaments are more hype. Tournaments are more analogous to other tournaments, which are what the qualifiers are for. And I feel like as a result, they like the combination of tournament and ladder play give you a better bang for your buck when it comes to testing your players and making sure that the best people can get in while at the same time not over engineering the system and just eating up everyone's days.
There's a couple of... Oh, no, go, Santtu.
Something like relating to ladder and tournament performance, you do need to keep in mind that 3 of the last Open winners from season 2 were all in top 5 in ladder points as well. So they a lot of people who did well in ladder also did well in tournament. I mean, I know it doesn't apply to everyone, but there was some definite correlation there.
You would like to hope there's some correlation that good players in ladder are also good in tournament, or there's something... I would say if there was almost no correlation, I'd be quite worried about the state of ladder. Maybe that's just my way of breaking it down.
Yeah.
But it's interesting. There's two kind of points, kind of, I suppose, for and against the way Rim's talking about it, that kind of pop into my head. One thing is that tournaments are way better to watch, and they're way more interesting. From I mean, I'm in a kind of privileged position where I get to be. I've been in 2 different teams now, trying to help people prepare for things. And even that whole process is way more interesting playing ladder, in my opinion. The level of thought that goes into the game is massively higher. The level of skill and talent, because on ladder, there's always that element of trying to guess, well, what if they have Jurden? Well, what if they have Igni? What if they have random card X, which randomly loses me the game, like a strange small percentage of the time? And you can lose games that way. Now, over the course of a whole season, that should balance out, really, in theory, unless you're having a particularly hideous meta season. But for the most part, there's always that element in ladder games where you can lose to just random bullshit card X. And tournament play, because there is open deck list, that doesn't happen. You know what options are available to your opponent, and so it lets you make more interesting, more calculated plays. Even one, I mean, everyone loves talking about the Paja play against our boy Coley, so we might as well mention that, as that's a play which people might not make on ladder, or might be incentivized not make, because, well, there's many units, but Paja can look at his deck, say, he's got this many units, how likely is it he's drawn none of them, make some calculations ahead and go, do you know what, I'm going to take this risk and make this play and take this line. And it won him the game because he could make a play based on Coley's exact deck. The only thing I would say about tournaments, which does sometimes make it a bit off or maybe less consistent, when you're in metas where there are lineups which are extremely kind of hard targeted or play very well into certain other lineups, if you have a lineup which matches up really badly against your opponents, it can just kind of be the end of your tournament. And that's one of the downsides, especially in a single elimination style tournament of a tournament, that if you do just run into the worst possible matchups for yourself, it can kind of not matter how well you play, you're just going to go out. At this level of the game, when everyone's obviously a really solid player, you're not going to get someone, outplaying to that extent very often, I would argue. And if they do, to be fair, it's a hell of a hats off to them, or you wonder what their opponent was up to. But yeah, that's the biggest downside of tournaments, I think, that you can end up with these lineup problems. But then I suppose you could argue that comes down to not bringing a lineup that can be hard targeted, or I don't know. There's a lot of different ways to look at it, but that's the worst element of tournaments, I think.
So on the open list part, I think this is also one of the things that the online format made a lot improved for the season 2. Because like in season 1 you had closed deck lists for day 1 of the tournament, and that made no
made
sense.
no
to me.
sense ever. It made no sense. The one day you don't know, and then you do. Like what? Why? It was so strange. It was fun. It was hype to watch it though, because it was hype to watch, I suppose, because you were like, "What? Has anyone brought any random crap? Oh, they have. Awesome poggers." But you know, it wasn't really. Yeah, from a competitive aspect, it made no sense. I would totally agree. It was always strange.
Is there any one thing that y'all would do that you would feel like boom, you're now in control? You can make one change to these tournaments. Is there anything that stands out that you were like, this is the one thing that I would do and it would improve everything?
That's a dangerous question to
I
answer.
only-
Yeah.
Can I think about it only from the competitive perspective, or can I do I need to consider whether or not it would make any sense for CDPR to do it for themselves?
You're going to improve the tournament, whether it be watching the tournament, whether it be playing it, whatever. You're going to make this the one thing whenever you watch a tournament that you think, oh, I wish this was it, or this would make it better. Is there anything in there?
So from watching perspective, not from player perspective.
Well, you can answer whatever you want, but I feel like I've just laid out a minefield here that
Yeah, like there are things you can say that can get you.
I just passed a grenade around and everyone's trying to put the pin back in. So how about then from a viewing perspective? What about that? Did nobody gets in trouble?
You say that. There's also ways to get in trouble if you're wise. I think. I mean, I'm gonna say this, and this is something that can't get me in trouble, but I'm just gonna say it anyway. In my opinion, I think casters should have to actively play the game. And some people are gonna dislike that, and some people say, and it's not against any of the particular casters. They all do the best they can, but you will get times where some of the ones who play the game less will say things that are kind of blatantly wrong or old information or something like that. And I don't think, from the point of view of, if you want tournaments to be a good way for new players to watch competitive play and to listen to people who really know the game, explain to them how these matchups are working out and why the players are making the decisions they're making, if the people doing that commentary work don't themselves understand why the plays are being made or how those decisions are come to or what cards do what, even at times, I think it's detrimental to the overall experience, especially for less experienced players. So that's my opinion. It's not fire the casters, we hate them all. It's more that I think they should just have to play, or at least consult with people who do more actively to really understand the meta before they cast the tournament. That's my opinion.
I wanted to answer this from both perspectives, actually. So from the viewer perspective, I would make qualifiers casted. I think they are planning on that for season 3. I'm not completely sure. But like having all these great players playing qualifiers and then having no way to view them unless the players themselves are streaming them makes no sense to me. And from the player perspective, I would make opens double elimination, but I completely understand why CD Projekt cannot and won't do it. But like as a player, it would be much nicer to play them as double elimination.
Okay, I think
single elim is problematic. Yeah, but sorry, on you go.
no, go ahead. You said single elim is problematic.
Mainly, well, it's kind of touching upon what I said before, that even if you have a best 5 where if there's one specific matchup that's really close, or you miss a very specific card in a certain spot, these kind of things can tilt a one-off series. And if a one-off series gets tilted that way and you don't have double elim, suddenly you're out. And from a competitive aspect, it can feel terrible to lose to a draw situation or to a matchup running out weirdly or something like that, and just have your tournament and all the work you've put in beforehand just be over. So double elim is definitely a fairer format for the players, but yeah, even in terms of like how long the days go and that sort of thing, it would be very, very difficult for CDPR to actually run it. But yeah, I agree with Santtu. From the competitive aspect, it would be a lot better.
The one caveat I will say to what Driftbling just said is that I do hear a lot of players say, I think single elim would be unfair, therefore let's do double elim. And for the first 2 rounds, double elim often feels like it may as well be single elim, like just with the days that you're forced to play. Nobody has been able to make it after like losing the first or the second round. and for good reason. That shit is mentally draining as hell. And you have tons and tons of other matchups, some of which are likely to be bad. I do feel like there's also maybe from this conversation, it would be possible to overemphasize the importance of matchups. I think that's actually one of the things that's really nice about competitive Gwent, is that to me, every series feels winnable. Like even the hard target ones, you only have to get one win that actually matters against those sorts of lineups. And with the way Gwent is built, that's usually possible if you take some risks. It's certainly not guaranteed to happen, and sometimes you will lose and feel like there wasn't much you could do about it. But like, it never feels like there's nothing to play for, and that's something I've appreciated a lot more. You know, having taken a month off last month, trying out Runeterra a little bit, playing in some of those tournaments, it felt like I was actually just flipping coins.
Well, yeah. I also tried Runeterra for a while when I was a bit bored of Gwent and had the exact same reactions. As, wow, as I'm playing Runeterra, I realized Gwent's fucking great.
Yeah.
I wonder how did I get lineups? I feel like what you said is true, but I kind of feel like there's a problem in that the reason you win that match, one match with the deck that is hard target, usually isn't because you played that much better, but it is because the opponent didn't throw the cards they need to win the match.
Opponent missed, yeah.
Mm.
I mean, so, I know what Rain means, though. There are certain spots where you can take a risky decision, but usually the risky decision does actually come down to they can't have drawn everything. Come on, like especially I think round one especially is one where you get in that spot a lot of times when you try and keep pushing out the round further and you quote unquote feel like you should. That's a spot.
I do have a counter example to what Santtu just said. Freddy versus Magpie, the most infamous hard target of all time. Freddy drew every card he needed. He just brought Arrakis Queen, and I feel like that kind of shows. You could say, oh, but he just brought Arrakis Queen, and that deck was terrible. Of course, he lost. But I feel like that shows sort of the level of ingenuity that both went into Freddy's hard target, and in like how Magpie sort of exploited its weakness that it ended up having. Like you could say, sure, Freddy could have built a better deck, and then he would have won. But that's I mean, I feel like that's agency in itself. And even in that case, then Magpie could have gone for the outs. Like ultimately, like I don't. There's not a perfect system. You kind of just want something that's at least interesting, in my opinion, as opposed to something that's well, I guess I lose to these decks, and there's nothing I can even try. And like these sorts of situations are also rare. Most of the your average lineup is not going to be a hard target. Hard targets in Gwent have been particularly weak most of the time.
Yeah, you look back in the history of competitive tournaments, and more often than not, hard targets don't actually work out in practice. Or at least that's when I look back at it and had a look through. It's the conclusion I came to.
I think you could have you in beta you can get away with it, but after Homecoming it has been really hard to win with the hard target lineup. But soft targeting is still very much possible. And
soft targeting.
Yeah, but I think that's perfectly. I think that's fair game.
Yeah, I think that's how it should be.
So we've covered a lot in here. We covered the Master Mirror expansion. We covered everything in there. We even covered a little Runeterra right there. So we all we love the game. Devote a lot of time to it, including when like days off, you set up a round table to have people discuss it and to do all that aspect. So we're going to start off. Let's start off with Redrame there. And it's how bright is the future of Gwent. Now, one thing I love about all y'all and why you're on here is honesty in that sense in here. So again, Redrame, lead us off with your thoughts on that.
All right. So I think the first thing I would say to how bright is the future of Gwent is that I absolutely believe that this is in the hands of the developers. I think that I personally, at least have been a little bit bearish on the future of Gwent. And that is more because of patterns that I see being made in like the processes of changes that CDPR has or hasn't made, rather than any sort of fundamental issue that couldn't be solved. I think that Gwent is a fantastic concept for a game. I think that there are a lot of ways to sort of swing things around, and I'm hoping that with things like the mobile release and big projects behind the scenes out of the way, that there might be more emphasis put towards maybe, I guess, less projects that are less about making Gwent functional and more about making Gwent enjoyable. Like, I think I'm not trying to diminish the importance of something like a mobile release that brought a lot of attention to the game. And the app was done well. I was pretty, at least the iOS one. I was pretty impressed by it, especially given their track record on some other things like the tournament client, which is another fun discussion point. But I mean, it's a little tough to know. I've seen the numbers swing up and down a lot as a streamer in terms of how many people are interested in Gwent. It's something that's very difficult to accurately assess. I would say that the future of Gwent is open ended, and it's on mostly CDPR, but also to an extent us as a community to sort of keep that fire going and to keep Gwent interesting.
Santtu, me or you? It's up to you.
Well, overall on Gwent, I kind of agree with Redrame. I think there's potential, and it's mostly up to what the developers will do with it. So when it comes to the competitive side of Gwent, I don't see the CDPR competitive side. I don't see it growing much in the near future, but I don't really see it going away either. I think it's just gonna stay around as it is right now. And for the community tournament side, a lot of the tournament client also kind of works for this. I think if the tournament client manages to do everything it should do right now when it comes out of beta and actually works, I think it will be great, and I think there will be a lot more community tournaments with the help of that. But it does need to actually work properly first. For example, not being able to run any Swiss with it is kind of awkward right now. And we have seen some pretty big community tournaments now recently, and I think it's on the rise right now, but it might not be as high as it was back in beta when there were community LAN tournaments around. So it's not that you can really have LAN tournaments right now.
For the future, I kind of brought up at the start, I slightly kind of read and talks about patterns, and the pattern that worries me, as I say, is that it seems like we get in. I remember talking to people at the start of this year talking about the idea that we need one really great expansion to bring in some really interesting cards and flesh out archetypes and save Gwent. And it feels like you can get into this cycle where expansion comes out, power creep, everyone hates it, slash certain cards get nerfed. Meta gets, stale, predictable, people go, all we need is a really good expansion to save us and save Gwent. Expansion comes out. And it feels like we've been here so many times before, it gets kind of hard to be massively optimistic, in my opinion, because it feels like, well, guess what's around the corner? Oh, a new expansion's coming out. And we all hope it's going to be this great expansion that flashes like archetypes and makes a lot of interesting cards and really builds on the foundations of Gwent. And I hope it is as well, but, chances are it's probably not going to be this magic silver bullet that some people are looking for it to be. Chances are there isn't such a thing that's realistically possible for everybody, because you can see that in history. Gwent, certain cards, some people will love, some people will hate. I'll mention as a funny one. I remember a long time ago, not a long time ago, but quite a while ago, me and Santtu had a bit of a debate back when I was in Bandigang about Kiki Queen, because it was a binary deck. But people like me loved it. I thought the deck was fun to play, but there was a lot of people who hated that deck. Elderbear is another one we already mentioned, where both Rim and Santtu's voiced they enjoyed the deck and liked what it did. But I know an awful lot of people who didn't. So this idea that there's going to be one massive silver bullet expansion is something I think as a community we probably need to get away from. But the biggest thing I'd point out to the bright side of the future of Gwent is, again, touching upon what Rame said. The fundamentals of Gwent are brilliant. They're really, really good. The control you have in mulliganing, yes, we miss cards occasionally. It's nothing compared to, we touched on Runeterra. I have defined that deck as top deck, that game as top deck simulator, and that's a bit unfair, but there's also some truth in it. You mulligan once, and then you draw what you draw, smiley face. If you draw the wrong cards for this matchup, you don't win. And that can happen to a much smaller extent in Gwent, but for the most part, the agency in actually playing the game is great. So yeah, I think it's the biggest thing is going to be can the design team really nail the design of cards that are interesting and fun without feeling busted or oppressive, and have lots of different options for players to play any sort of deck they want without, again, touching what Rain pointed out earlier, that feeling that there's certain cards you just have to run if you're going to play this faction. And if you don't do it, you're trolling or giving up a huge amount of power. If we can end up in a space where factions have different, fairly fleshed out archetypes that you can mix and match how you want and try and play for different combinations of cards, while still being viable at a high level, that's the kind of dream, right? So if we can get there, that'd be great. And it's a challenge to the design team to be able to get there.
One thing I always hear is, like you mentioned there about the expansion, or something has to come out to take Gwent to the next level, whether it's popularity or whatever. The question is, does it actually have to do that? Is Gwent good enough? Is it fun enough? Is it sustainable enough right now to be where it is in the CCG market, I guess, or wherever it is as a game?
So from the point of view of, it depends what you want Gwent to be, I suppose. If you want it to be the magic killer, I guess, for lack of a better way of thinking of it, I think a lot of that comes down to marketing as much as anything else, or like getting eyes on the game. I don't know what CDPR will have internal numbers about, well, the the video game equivalent of viewer retention, and how many people come to try out the game or try it out a couple of times on their phone, actually stick around and will play the game for a long time. In terms of, the money involved, it's not, as far as I understand it, at the levels of some other card games that are around, but it's I think it's going to be a slow build. I don't think dumping money into Gwent randomly, marketing wise, would suddenly solve everybody's problems with that. But I think for me, it comes from design. If everybody in Gwent is enjoying playing Gwent, you're more likely to have the word of mouth spread. You're more likely for adverts to kind of work because people come in, and as soon as they start talking to Gwent people, they'll be super welcoming. To be fair, I've found that if you talk to small streamers, for example, or whatever, there will tend to be a few people from the community who are very welcoming. I think Gwent is quite good for that. I've definitely experienced in other games that are far less so. That's not to say there's no toxicity in the Gwent community. We could look at a certain website beginning with REDD, where you could find plenty of interesting comments. But for the most part, I think Gwent's got a decent community. It's got, as I say, the good fundamentals for a game. If you have the game be fun for the majority of people and be balanced well and have interesting different decks you can play, and then also you do probably have to increase the marketing if you want to increase your market share. But yeah, I don't think it's doomed or anything like that, but I don't think it's going to magically blow up overnight either.
I agree about the most part. I think Gwent is doing well, but I don't see it becoming the biggest card game unless all the other ones somehow magically screw up. But I don't think Gwent can become the biggest one just by being better, because the other ones have such a huge following from other sources as well.
Yeah, I largely agree with what was said. I feel like Gwent definitely, like, I don't really view Gwent as ever being something like, as Driftbling, I guess, to borrow Driftbling's term, I don't really view Gwent as ever being a magic killer, because I feel like a lot of what's appealing to Gwent, or appealing about Gwent, can sort of be framed in the context of what does this game do that something like Magic doesn't do. And I feel like one of the big, at least for me, what was really appealing about Gwent was sort of just how refreshing the mechanics were compared to other card games that I had played. And I feel like without those other card games, Gwent loses some of its value in that sense. So I feel like to some extent, like, it would be possible in theory for Gwent to take over, but it's difficult to see in my eyes.
Well, y'all heard it here first. The future's bright. It's going to kill every other card game, and everything is perfect. Okay,
I want to randomly throw out Sorry,
Go
sorry,
ahead.
Fox, to cut over you. So here's an interesting question, just based on something that actually happened a little while ago, where a pretty large streamer kind of popped into Gwent for 5 minutes and then kind of left again. Do we think that an influx of just a randomly huge mega streamer, 30k streamer, suddenly decide to start streaming Gwent, how would that impact it, do we think, in terms of, would it be good for Gwent? Would it be bad for Gwent? Like, I don't know. It was just something that I thought about with the popularity thing. I hope you don't
As
mind
a
me
former
hijacking.
Prismata player, I can answer this question.
Ooh, interesting. Okay.
No. In the one term, no.
That's what I thought. That's what I thought. Yeah.
Unless that streamer actually like actively was playing the game and was interesting to watch for playing the game rather than explicitly for that streamer. Ultimately, I don't think it will really do anything because it will sort of be being used as a prop rather than as a game that's being showcased to the audience. Like in the case of the streamer was it was Greek God, that's who it was. Who I had heard of before. He played Gwent for like an hour, and then he did tons of other random shit on that stream. Like, if you were an average viewer of that streamer, you probably had forgotten that Gwent existed by the end of that stream.
Yeah.
And I feel like that. I'm certainly not trying to bash people that were sponsored to play Prismata at one point, but it really kind of showed that unless the person was invested in the product, people that are invested in the person will not necessarily be invested in your product just because they're playing that game.
Don't mention Red Shadow Legends. Don't mention Red Shadow Legends.
Fuck. Yeah.
I think the big rumor that keeps coming about with like Gwent, someone doing it, is if Henry Cavill like played it and like streamed it. Because apparently, I guess he's said that he's played it before, but I think what he meant was like playing Gwent during Witcher 3 as opposed to playing the standalone card game. But that's something that people bring up, that if he was to do it, and why doesn't Netflix and the TV show get with, CD Projekt and deal with that? And it's like, well, maybe because they're two completely separate companies with a overarching product that's kind of the same. But that's the thing there, because who was the big streamer you said that returned to it? Can you say who it is?
Greek God X.
Okay.
I personally know him because he formerly played Minecraft with Tyler 1, and I should probably be more embarrassed to admit that than I am.
I know I've heard of Tyler 1. Did he get famously banned for something?
Yeah, he used to stream. Well, he does stream League of Legends. He got banned and then unbanned after a Riot employee majorly fucked up and said something like really inappropriate about him. And like as a result, I don't know the whole mess, but he's certainly a personality. He's also streaming right now. If you really want context,
is he streaming Minecraft?
No, he's streaming League of Legends.
Oh, okay.
I imagine
he played Minecraft while he was banned.
He'll be screaming at somebody. Nothing sure.
Okay.
I mean, that's about all you know.
Yeah.
I'll take y'all's word for that. Okay, now that's the dismount that we were looking for here.
Go watch T1. Oh god.
There you go.
No.
All right, like to thank.
Don't do that.
All right, I'd like to thank guests here, Driftbling, Redrame, Santtu. Thank y'all very much coming on here, giving these thoughts. I hope everybody enjoyed it. I hope for this to be, every couple of months or something like that, a series starting out, getting in a bunch of different people in here, their thoughts on it. All their information, all their contact information will be in the show notes. As far as upcoming things, Team Aretuza, we're having a tournament December 19th and 20th, a charity tournament, Aretuzas Without Borders, where people can donate money to that. It will not only go towards Doctors Without Borders, 20% of total donations will go right into the player pool. So not only are you giving to a great charity, you will also be helping out these people who entertain you so much playing the great game of Gwent. So
can I just say, as someone who's was working behind the scenes on organizing this thing, thank you so much for this idea. Like that tournament, I'm looking forward to it so much. It's such a good idea. Like even ignoring the charity part of it, which I think is really awesome. It's just I'm kind of amazed that there weren't just more bare bones tournaments with good players in them. It's something that's really exciting to see.
Okay, yeah, and that's a big thing there, and so yeah, that's pretty much what's going to be. Is I hope I give away a shit ton of money. There's no amount there that I'm going to be like, oh my god, can I do it? I hope it is a huge success. It's another thing I hope to do. I hope again other people start to do it. Because yeah, you're right. The charity notwithstanding, which again is a big reason why it's done, I think it is good to really help out the people who are the content creators and who do all this, because the good words and stuff are all fine, but they're trying to do it for a living. They're trying to do it. Nothing's better than money. That's for sure. So yeah, be on the lookout for that. All that announcements, the final announcements for that, I think player pool and all that will come eventually. Other than that, thanks my guests again. Thanks for y'all in the chat, everybody watching, and whatever happens next time, I'll see you there.